This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Welcome back to the second part of my conversation with ChangeMaker Alexandra Jackiw, the Chief Operating Officer at Hayes Gibson Property Services. Alex, we've been discussing the pandemic's effect on the housing industry, but was there something that surprised you about the way associations and management companies responded to the crisis?
I think what surprised me is hearing from other people in the industry how cavalier some companies were in the treatment of their employees, leaving offices open, requiring people to work, not providing PPE. If employees needed face masks, they needed to source those on their own. I really struggled with that piece because maybe I'm overprotective of my employees, but again, as I said earlier, if you take care of your employees will take care of your residents. So that took me aback a little bit. The one thing that has been extraordinarily rewarding, however, is how resilient our field personnel have been and how focused they were on taking care of residents and how creative they were in their approaches. I had one maintenance supervisor on one of our conference calls. We were talking about people struggling to find hand sanitizer and wipes and gloves. And he recounted to me that he lived, a small rural Kentucky community, that he had befriended the manager of the local hardware store, and the manager at the hardware store had disclosed to him when he received shipments of supplies, and that was the best time to try to restock. So once the maintenance supervisor had this information, he got up early one morning, parked his car in the parking lot, waited for the freight truck to arrive, unload at the loading dock at the back door, and then immediately sped into the store to purchase the supplies he needed. So, it's a silly story, but it's a story that kind of highlights how much people care and the kind of lengths they will go to get their jobs done.
Mm-hmm. And it's not a silly story in the fact that it really shows how many people in the affordable housing industry want to kind of reach out and take care of more than just the unit, more than just the roof. They're concerned about the wellness of their residents as a community as well. And the attachment of your employees that are willing to go out and be the first one to buy that and bring it back to their property, instead of just kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, we'll get some when we get some.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. I mean, those, and I have a myriad of those kinds of stories from all over the areas where we manage, where people just went above and beyond in very heartwarming and special ways.
Another thing about this that you've written and been very outspoken about is the looming eviction crisis.
Oh, yeah.
And how that has changed our industry, how even construction costs, everything, construction costs, construction loans, like everything's been impacted, but expand on some of that for us.
Well, there's so much our industry is facing, and we're in the unique position of being the safety net for a huge percentage of the population, a higher percentage of the population than as a country we should have. If you read the State of the Nation's Housing that's published annually by the Joint Center on Housing Studies at Harvard, and you realize the vast percentage of people that have high housing cost burdens, it's dramatic. And it is something that has not been addressed at the federal level for a lot of years. We build 120, 150,000 LIHTC units a year maybe, and demolish that many, and we're not making much headway into having a conversation about what's going on in that space, and hoping that all the nonprofits and all the charitable groups are somehow going to address a need that's huge in scope. And so I think that we have an obligation to ensure that we house the generation of the future. And, there have been lots of studies done that health outcomes and educational outcomes are tied to housing security or a lack thereof to housing insecurity. And we need to be talking to our congressional leaders, to our state leaders about their commitment to making this a focus. Corporations are making it a focus. Amazon and Google are building workforce housing, and we need to get the government focused on programs that work and programs that provide a lot more supply that we're seeing. You mentioned the eviction crisis. January 31 is almost upon us. The eviction moratorium expires. I don't want to see us flood our courts with people and move them out of their units because their financial circumstances were such that they couldn't pay the rent. But the government needs to provide housing operators with some type of financial assistance to be able to keep those residents that have been impacted in place, and for us to continue to have the financial viability to manage those assets and provide that affordable housing.
You've mentioned increasing the supply. You've mentioned making sure that we retain our commitment to affordable housing. And now you've just mentioned emergency rental assistance. I mean, you've pretty much mapped out a housing direction, the key points for a new administration. Are there any other points that you would want to convey to the new administration that, must do or must not do in this space?
Well, the only thing I would hope for this administration is that they're successful and that they learn how to play nice in the sandbox with people that don't necessarily agree with their direction. I think that to the extent that we can come to the table with an open mind and with good ideas about solutions and bring the industry, bring the multifamily housing people, the affordable housing industry into the equation to help provide ideas and discussion points around how best to address these issues, we'll all be better off.
So, one of the things that you talked about earlier here is the commitment to affordable housing and how we have an obligation, to the next generation and to the current people as well who are in those programs. And, there's a program that HUD runs. It's the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program.
Yep.
And you've been a strong supporter, all along. And why do you think, this is either maybe why do you think it's such an important tool, or what have you seen this do for your industry?
Well, the RAD program was just that. It was meant to be a demonstration program, but it was essentially established by Congress to provide a solution to the huge capital needs that public housing projects required. And without the funds available to make the kinds of repairs that are needed in public housing projects that are decades old, you're going to continue to see the 60-minute news story about the horrible public housing conditions. And so as those funds became available, it was interesting to see the public-private partnership, if you will, that allowed public housing authorities to create more livable spaces for people that needed it. I've been fortunate over the last year of working with two public housing agencies on RAD projects. In one instance, we're a consultant on a project that's being converted from public housing to a tax credit with what's called PBRA, project-based rental assistance. And in another instance, managing on behalf of a housing authority in a kind of a co-management relationship, 8 projects that have been through the RAD process that are tax credit with PBRA and some housing choice vouchers. And the programs are incredibly successful. I just hope that Congress takes a long, hard look at RAD and reallocates dollars and continues to support that program and support the needs of the housing authorities.
And I would even add to, making sure that they retain that program and add more money. But
Amen.
not every housing authority can fit the RAD financing dynamics. And so they still have an obligation to go back with those capital improvements as well, because not every agency is going through RAD. So I think both of those definitely have to be put on the appropriations, priorities as well.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think more agencies need to be educated on what's available to them, as well as, the agency boards, the housing authority boards need to understand what programs are available and how they can help push that process.
I want to ask you a question, just kind of again, changing it up here, changing the direction. I can't let you go without asking a few questions. I feel like you've got so much wisdom here. So, in the leadership or management space, you said that you taught many courses on transformation leadership. What do you tell your students as far as I think students a lot of times, they understand the typical goal setting, they understand, performance tracking, they understand quality. Where it gets really hard, I think, when people talk about leadership is when it doesn't go right, when things aren't working, when you're not in the designation or you're not turning out the production and, you have to make corrective action or you have to fix a mess up. How do you tell your students or how do you instruct them to handle those times?
Those times vary. I believe that our biggest learning lessons that we grow from is when we make mistakes. And many, many years ago, I had a regional vice president that I thought was going to visit my property to fire me, and instead came to the property to better understand my thought process and why I made the decision that I made, slapped my hand and told me not to do it again, asked me what I'd learned from that experience, and then promptly told my supervisor that he'd rather have people in the field trying to make a decision than sitting on their hands waiting for somebody to make the decision for them. And I was a very young woman in those days, and I think that literally formed the basis for kind of one of the key leadership strategies that I try to employ is to let people embrace their failures, to learn from them, and to help guide their thinking and how they could have handled a situation better. There isn't much that we can't fix that is going to create a major catastrophe. Everything is fixable, but it's those teaching moments, it's those special moments that help you develop people and improve their management skills as well as their leadership skills that stays with them over the course of their career.
That is a fantastic example. And I think several of us can point to a moment where they've said, this is what I learned the hard way. But the painful reality is man, why do you have to learn the hard way? Right?
It's always going to happen. I try to do a little bit of reading when I get a chance. And one of the most fascinating things I've been reading about is something called the VUCA world. VUCA is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that pretty much wraps up where we've been for the last year. And so, as I think about how do you counter those four very dramatic impacts on how we do business, there's a lot there to help people work through in a way that will help position them to be stronger leaders in the future.
Well, I love that acronym too, that we are all working in such a way in our day to day or in our leadership style to keep this VUCA mindset or this VUCA leadership theory in our forefront. Because if anything, we've definitely learned that over the last soon to be year. Well, as I wrap up here for our podcast listeners, one of the things that we have been working with the National Apartment Association on is to bring a nationally recognized certified apartment manager accreditation to affordable housing practitioners. And I'm really excited about what the National Apartment Association is doing in that space. And as the final touches on the rollout plan are occurring, is there anything that you would like to give our podcast listeners a preview about that?
I was grateful to be part of the discussion with your company about the rollout of the CAM designation, Certified Apartment Manager designation. I'm excited. I think that one of the things that NAA has done well is to provide education for field personnel to help them understand what their role is, how they can execute better in the field, and kind of the reasons behind it and best practices. So from my perspective, I think the affordable housing world has done a wonderful job focused on compliance training and focused on making sure that TIC is correct and your annual owner cert gets filed on time and your MOR responses are handled. But operationally, how to manage an asset and think about it as a financial investment as well for the operators is something that I think is needed. And I'm excited that NAA and Quadel are partnering with on that effort to see kind of where we can take it to the next level. I was involved in tweaking the curriculum and the outline and providing suggestions. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the end result is.
I am too. And I think that this is going to be such a fantastic model for us. And it's really going to really just kind of, it's got its place here. It makes sense in the continuum of what we're doing as well. Well, thank you so much. It has been so good to catch up with you. And I'm glad that you have brought all this information for our listeners. And more importantly, I'm just glad that you are alongside all of us in this space doing what we do every day for affordable housing and for the people who are living in affordable housing. Thank you.
Katie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for including me on your podcast.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.